The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
Good day, everyone. A tip of the cap. This is the end of my week. It's weird, actually, that the end of my week is on Wednesday now. Welcome to Fantasy NBA Today. Dan Besbris, Brandon Marcus. Brandon, you've I don't think you're on anymore this week, right? Have Neil and Adrian hit you up for as guest co-host for the last 2 days of the week yet?
Yeah, Neil hit me up, and I haven't been able to make it work. I was actually going to try and get with him last week, but I think Coach jumped on with him, and then I was unavailable for. I think he asked me about this week. I don't think I can do that this week since I'm back to CSUN softball for the final series of the season, at least the home series. So all right. I'll jump on with him maybe next week.
Yeah, we'll get you. Well, I screwed over Ethan Noroff earlier this week, so I'm making sure that he gets on at some point. My schedule was stupid, and I still was dealing with the lingering effects of this voice thing that finally is mostly gone. I think I sound like myself now. Like the noise in my headset resembles the thing that I used to hear before it. This was... I don't know, man. At Dan Besbris, by the way, on Twitter. At BD Marcus in the Twitters is... Wait, is there a 2 at the end? No,
no, that's the Instagram, actually.
That's right. Okay, yeah, I get those things mishmashed every once. At BD Marcus on Twitter. Just watching a game out of the corner of my eye, so I'm going to get distracted every once in a while.
Hey, me too.
Yeah, when you record the thing during the NBA playoffs the night before, these types of things are just going to shake out. I don't know, man. Brandon, when was the last time you had like a real legitimate viral laryngitis? It has probably been like 15 years for me between them, and this made up for lost time.
I'm not sure I remember the last time I had like full-on laryngitis, and which is crazy because of the amount that I actually speak.
Yeah.
I went through a nice period, though, this year, about a month ago, where I had a sore throat every single broadcast.
Oh.
Like if I started talking like for a solid 30 minutes in a row, or maybe even less, I started getting a sore throat. So I went through the end of February through the Big West tournament and softball, because they do double headers, which is even more brutal.
Oh man,
with a sore throat. So I had throat lozenges that I was popping all the time.
What's the lozenge of choice? What's your go-to flavor?
Hall's Defense.
It's got zinc.
Yeah. Extra soothing.
I like the Breezers. They're a lighter one, but they're flavorful. They're delightful. You know what the actual cure-all is for a sore throat on broadcast?
What?
Beer.
Really? Have you done it before?
No. Wink, wink.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. That's what happens when your last name is Blaze.
Yeah. Let me just tell a story, because I don't actually care if anybody knows these things now. The Bakersfield Blaze press box was the most disgusting and wonderful place on planet Earth. It obviously, like the ballpark, faced the wrong direction, so we looked straight into the setting sun going into the ball game. And there were 4 of us that needed to be in there. 2 broadcasters, the PA announcer, and the official score. And the PA announcer and the score, those that have heard me tell any of these stories before, you've probably heard me mention, just filthy. Just yelling back and forth, like things that absolutely positively cannot go over a broadcast. And that was just part of it. And it was a magical place, and it was made doubly magical because one of those 2 gentlemen was well connected with a local microbrew, and so would often bring a growler of whatever their like seasonal drink was and stick it in the press box fridge. And so we all had we'll call them soda cups, so not see-through, and they had soda in them, obviously, during the ball game. So it's the only way you get through, 140 minor league games, 70 of them you do just with a slight buzz. You just have to. It loosens up the vocal cords. Everything gets easier. It's 115 degrees and 0% humidity, so you're just like coughing dust. You got to wash that dust down, man. You got to have a little fresh product. I highly recommend it.
I like that story. That's a good one. And when I am in a spot where I won't get fired for drinking on the job, I will absolutely take that advice.
Yeah, you can't be courtside at a basketball game with it. It's a little too obvious. You got to be hiding up above secluded in a press box where nobody can actually see you, or you got your little nook. You do whatever you got to do in that joint.
Exactly.
So yeah, that to me is that's my favorite throat lozenge. So playoff basketball. Let's talk a little playoff basketball. By the way, it's Fantasy NBA Today. I think I mentioned that. Brought to you as always by Hoopball and of course Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee Company. That's probably a really good throat lozenge if I could actually handle caffeine. And also a Bakersfield story that I'll tell someday on this podcast about how I figured out that I couldn't handle caffeine.
Ooh, fun.
Nah, not that fun. This one's not less funny than the other one. This one's just more about me in pain. HawaiianIsles.com is the website, at HI Kona Coffee on Twitter, and you can get it on Amazon. Search for Hawaiian Isles. Just check out all the different flavors. You look at all those things, one of them is going to jump out to you as something you'll want to try. So, first thing from last night, Brandon, Milwaukee even things up with the Celtics, and they did so decisively. What did you see in that game that you didn't see in game one? Is this something you think Milwaukee can take onto the road with them? Because, the defense was there. The Bucks can play good defense. They did so in this one. They didn't really in game one. They hit 23 pointers in this ball game last night. That was crazy.
Yeah, they attempted a bunch of them. They attempted 47 threes, which is crazy. And that just tells you a little bit about how basketball is going nowadays. Very Houston Rockets-esque. The one thing with Milwaukee is that in game one, Lopez and Bledsoe were combined 2 for 10. Bledsoe, 7 for 12. Lopez, 3 for 10. I mean, one of those two guys has to contribute because it can't just be Middleton and Giannis. And also, Giannis wasn't making shots. I think he shot in the first game.
Not
was
good.
Around like 30% or something.
Yeah.
7 for 16 in this one with 2 for 4 from 3, which showed that he can actually step outside and hit a couple, which they now have to respect, hopefully, if you're Milwaukee. So I think that Milwaukee just wasn't making shots in the first game. And same thing goes for Boston in this game. I mean, they went a solid 13 or 14 straight possessions where they were missing shots and turning the basketball over. And that's very unlike Boston. So it seems like a series that's going to go 7 games because they're just going to keep exchanging games where one team is just shooting the ball better, I would imagine. But it's surprising that they've been blowouts in the first 2. That's the thing that's kind of weird to me.
That was the point I was going to grab onto as well. I'm glad you brought that up. It's weird that they basically both, I think it was 22 points in the first one and 21 in this one. They haven't been competitive, even though both teams are really, really good. And so you're right. It does come down to somebody making a shot. Kyrie Irving was 4 for 18 in this ball game. Giannis got to the free throw line 18 times. That was a big deal. He just kept attacking even when there were 4 guys in front of him and he was getting fouled. They used a little more Niko Mirotic in this ball game. He didn't shoot the ball well, but he factored into the ball game. Middleton was good. Bledsoe was good. A lot of guys were good on the Milwaukee side. Not that many guys were very good for Boston. It was, Al Horford was excellent again, that he had 5 turnovers. The interesting thing, too, in this series, Brandon, if you remember last year they went 7 games and the home team won every single one. Already we've seen that string broken in this series.
Yeah, and you would think that home court advantage would actually mean something. It usually does, I think, more so for Boston. But that being said, Milwaukee's just so good. The one thing that'll be interesting to see is how they adjust to Chris Middleton. Because I think they need to figure out that if they can stop the supporting cast and just let Giannis get his 30-plus or whatever, I think that they know they can win ball games. And Kyrie's not going to shoot as poorly as he did. So I think everyone now is looking at this series a little closer than they were before, because I think people are kind of all right, let's put Milwaukee in the Eastern Conference Finals and kind of writing off Boston, but I don't think we can do that.
Yeah, looking at the 2 Eastern Conference series, and we didn't have a Philly-Toronto game happen last night. They're playing this evening instead, but it feels pretty evenly matched. Sorry, they're not playing this evening. They're back in action tomorrow. They had a couple days off between games. It really feels like a 4-horse race right now. Does anybody feel like they're out in front of anyone else?
No. You really can make a legit claim for every single team at this point. I mean, you can make a legit claim in the West also for Nuggets or Blazers, and you can make a legit claim in the West for Warriors or Rockets. And then you obviously in the East, you don't know. So I really think it's wide open, and no one can definitively say that they know who is going to be in the NBA Finals.
which is good because that's likely going to create some measure of betting value. And, of course, we'll talk about that on Tuesdays. Tuesdays are gambling day here on the pod with myself and the marvelous Neil Rochlani. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out what we think is going to happen in Game 3. I have no idea Boston is favored, by the way, by 1.5 in that ballgame. Very narrow home favorite, pretty close to a pick'em. If you believe in what the line is telling you, then Vegas thinks it's going to be a close ball game. Obviously, they're just trying to split the money, but I'm actually inclined to agree. I think maybe we finally get a competitive one in this third ball game.
Yeah, I think so too, but I would think that that's a game where Boston narrowly wins and Brad Stevens makes the adjustments he needs to, and then Milwaukee comes back in Game 4 and wins. By the way, I've been wrong, I think, on every single prediction. So, with that being said, I was also the one that said the Clippers were going to lose in 5 games, and they showed some fight again at Oracle. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to be close. I would have to agree with that line. A little surprised it's only 1.5, by the way. You would think it'd be a little bit larger with Boston being at home, but it tells you how much Vegas likes Milwaukee.
Yeah, and so did everybody else, and rightfully so. They looked like the better team coming into this series. But Boston in Game 1, they put a little bit of a shock into them. We'll see if they can carry that sucker through. Warriors-Rockets is happening as we record this podcast. That ball game is at halftime right now, so we don't know exactly how that's going to go. Warriors are up by 9. James Harden got punched in the eye in this one. Steph Curry's finger came out of its socket. Can I describe this ballgame, Brandon, as anything other than kind of gross so far?
No. I think that says it right. But the one thing I'm happy about so far, and I say so far with a very big asterisk, is that people aren't complaining on Twitter about the refs.
Yay!
And that was because that really pissed me off, honestly, the last couple of days with how much people were talking about the refs. You have 2 really good teams in this series, and we're now analyzing where James Harden lands on his 3-pointers, and it's not the way that we should be doing this, and it's really unfair to the refs. I mean, you're putting a lot of the spotlight on them unnecessarily. I think the NBA needs to do something about it because these guys, the players, are just treating the refs like absolute crap at this point. And you look at, I saw a video on Twitter today, I retweeted it, James Harden and how he shoots uncontested threes versus contested threes, and he throws his body at defenders. And I'm sure Curry does the exact same thing in certain situations, and it's very tough to defend a guy like Harden when he's throwing his body at you. And I said it on Twitter, I really think that he is one of the toughest guys to officiate since Shaq, because you don't know what is actually a foul.
He's a little bit of a basketball savant, right? To know that he can do things with his body that other guys just haven't figured out how to do. Every offseason they try to take away something that Harden has sort of stolen away from the playbook or the rule book, where it's like, all right, how can I get around rule 2? Maybe I'm making more of a baseball reference here, where it's like page 42, rule C, subset 2I. You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
I don't know if basketball has a rule book that's quite that in depth, but I get the feeling that in the offseason, Harden's just like, all right, I can figure out a loophole in that one. I can figure out a loophole in that one. And then you go into the season, and the officials are like, well, he's right. I guess I got to call it. It was a little bit weird. I'm like you. I'm glad that it's done. Twitter was kind of annoying me that I had to look at that. Both teams kind of trolling one another for the last couple of days. So far, anything can happen in the second half, right? We might see 9 foul shots in the fourth quarter for a guy that hasn't happened yet as we record this podcast, and then all of that goes straight down the toilet. So we'll reserve final plaudits for NBA Twitter and this ball game until after it's over. Want to talk a little fantasy? I got one lesson to review from seasons past.
Ooh, let's hear it.
Okay, so this is one I've done before, but I thought it was so important that I wanted to bring it back because I'm actually pretty well convinced that the only reason I was able to take money in both of my my money roto leagues, the ones that I care about, is because I did not stash any injured players on draft day. And this isn't a rule that I think everybody is going to buy into. I don't know that I think I'm probably in the slight majority, but I by no means think that this is a unanimous thing. And that is, I only like to draft players that I know are healthy on day 1 of the NBA season. I will give an explanation as to why, but I want to know if you agree or disagree first.
Well, Personally.
Oh, sorry. Wait, before I let you go,
Yes.
standard redraft, not keeper.
Okay.
Not
Okay,
keeper.
well, keep that. That was where I was going with this. Is that keeper league? I drafted DeMarcus Cousins.
Right, that's a brilliant move.
For $3, and so I have him for $10 this year because it increases by 7. So I have Cousins, and that's why I did it. And he was sitting on my bench. But I would agree with you in a standard format because you don't know how long they're going to be out. They could say 1 to 2 weeks, and they could have a setback, so that could hurt you even more. B, you don't want to get off to such a bad start in your Roto league, especially Roto.
Yes.
Where you're starting to chase. And I mean, I'm in a Roto for fantasy baseball. And when you get behind, it's really tough. And you need as many healthy bodies to get you those points, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, etc. Than you need. I mean, you can't just have guys sitting there that aren't going to play. Sure, some are going to be helpful down the line. But if you draft a guy that's healthy versus a guy that's not healthy and you have him sitting there, most of the time the production is going to be greater from the guy that you drafted. That when you're thinking A or B, A healthy is going to be better than the production you get from B not healthy.
You hit on all of the points that I was going to make. So congratulations, the podcast is over.
Great. All right, cool.
All right,
I guess I've earned my money and I finally can say staff next to mine.
That's right. It's time to retire. What are you doing after the show?
No, just hanging out. I'm now the king of hoopball.
Yep, you're done.
Do whatever I'd like.
So here are the names that I went back through this most recent season, and I have had some names off the top of my head from the previous year that I've now since forgotten because once I went through this year, it's like you get one song unstuck from your head, you get another song stuck. You're never getting the first one back in there. I don't remember the exact timeline of these guys, but I'm fairly certain that the following 7 players were either injured coming into the year or in the case of one of them coming back from a career-altering injury. And those names are Russell Westbrook, who was ruled out for a couple of weeks shortly before the season. I think he was out for like 5 weeks.
We didn't know how long he was going to be out, by the way.
Right.
That was one where we didn't know what the hell was going on, how long he was going to be out for.
Yes. So, I mean, he was... I couldn't remember the specifics around it. John Collins, I think, got ruled out about a week or two before the season for a few weeks, and then that stretched into 2 months. Boogie, obviously, that was an obvious one. He was coming off of the ACL thing. Kristaps Porzingis, the Achilles. Porzingis was the ACL. And then Lauri Markkanen was injured coming into the season. The other guys that I threw into the list as sort of the honorary mentions were Gordon Hayward, coming off of destroying his entire leg, and Dwight Howard, who... I think he played in like half a game, and then his back went out, and then there was the whole injured butt, and then all the other weird stuff that came out. But we don't need to get into that. So I thought we'd just stick with the main 5 there. Westbrook, John Collins, Boogie, Porzingis, Lauri Markkanen. You could make the argument that in a head-to-head format, the discount you got on a guy like Boogie, a guy like Markkanen, any of the 5 might make it worth it. In Roto, I would say definitely not. But overall, I still lean towards the no because, like you said, your first point, which I believe was you just don't know how long they're going to be out, ended up being a really big deal for guys like Boogie and Porzingis because you had to sit. Not only did you have to sit on a guy, let's say you don't even have an injured spot in your league, these guys are taking up a roster spot all season long you could be using to go hunt for someone with some upside. But Porzingis didn't even play. He didn't even hit the court. So you literally had dead weight. You played your entire season with 12 roster slots instead of 13. That's a huge disadvantage, especially, as you mentioned with your other point, is you don't want to fall behind. If you fall behind and you're down a roster spot, you're way up a creek.
Yeah, and if you think about it, Markkanen, sure, he was helpful for probably a good 2-month stretch, I would say, where he was actually reliable. But then at the end, he was shut down, help you in the last couple of weeks. And so he didn't help you at the beginning of the season when you needed it, and he helped you at the end of the season when you needed it. And Westbrook had probably his worst season we've seen from him in a while. He couldn't make a free throw. He couldn't make a shot. He was turning the ball over all the time, so he didn't have a good year. And you look at some of these players, like even a guy like Cousins, he was sitting a bunch of games. You need healthy bodies. You need production. Sure, these guys are great when they're on the court. We're not looking at their averages, though. You don't play Roto based on what a guy averages during the season. You play Roto based on what they accumulate. and you need them to play to accumulate.
Yeah, you make a good point. Lauri Markkanen was by average the number 44 ranked guy in 9-category format. By totals, 113. And so that's that big gap when you're not playing a ton of ball games. So you, like we were talking about, you could argue he was super helpful when he was out there, but 52 games is a big difference than 70. If you're splitting hairs, 70 versus 72 games, something like that, you obviously want the guy whose average is way better. But 52 games, that's a spot where if you're in a roto format, you got to make sure you have someone else to fill in those other 30 to 35 games, depending on what your games cap might be. You sort of need to go into the season with a different plan. And so, again, if you're not in a keeper format, I think you're just setting the bar. You're setting yourself too far behind the 8 ball. Brandon, I'll add one more note. That's a little bit, it's almost like a corollary, I think, to you don't want to fall too far behind. The guys you draft that aren't injured on opening day probably will end up injured at some point during the year. So you could actually end up sort of overloading with injured guys. This happened to me last season, not this most recent one, but the previous one, where I drafted 1 or 2 guys at a massive discount because they were hurt, and then I had 2 other guys on my team get hurt immediately, like right at the beginning of November, and I had Rob Covington, who was just brutal to start the 2018 season. Folks may not remember, he shot like 19% for a month that year. And so I got stuck in a spot where I basically looked at my team and had to say, okay, either I drop someone who's slumping and looks terrible, I drop one of these guys that I drafted to stash, and that doesn't feel like a very good decision, or I just start like 9 healthy guys for a month and pray to the good Lord that I can run 14 healthy bodies out there for the last 3 months of the year, which, by the way, pretty much never happens unless you're the luckiest player on earth. So not only are you drafting an injured guy, but you're going to end up sort of loading up as other guys get hurt. That's a really hard thing to come back from.
Yeah, it's a good call. Everyone does seem to miss a game or two, unless you're a guy like Karl Anthony Towns or Lillard, where they just fight through everything. But yeah, I mean, these guys are going to miss games for little niggles. I mean, it's just one of those things where you have a sore right knee and you're on a back-to-back. You're going to sit one of those games. It just happens. And especially when you're grabbing guys on good teams, the good teams are going to rest their best players here and there. Like, that will happen where it's load management. And it's just, you have to deal with it. And so you have to account for that, plus the guys that are injured, and you put yourself in a really big hole.
And I know what one of the arguments, and I'm trying to look at this sort of from the other side now to say, what about this? I think the what about this is, what if I can get a guy at an intense discount? And I still think I don't care. And I know that that's a little bit too black and white for a game that has a lot of gray area and a lot of exceptions. But again, if you're not able to keep the guy, and if you're in a head-to-head league, I get wanting to have a really good team come playoff time, but you kind of also have to make sure you secure your playoff berth first. And that's tough to do, especially if you're in a daily head-to-head league where you're just taking zeros from a couple of spots on your roster. You're not going to be in the top 2 or 3 teams with dead weight coming right out of the chute. You're going to be in the bottom chunk because most of the other teams aren't doing that same thing. I hate the idea of falling behind. It's soul-crushing.
Yeah, I can see you making a case for a guy like Russell Westbrook in an auction league. Let's say he goes for 9 or 10 or something like that, and he goes for a very cheap price. I can see you doing that where you're not spending a lot of budget on him. But that being said, people need to realize that, sure, let's say that you don't take Russell Westbrook and you take, I don't know, let's see, he's available in the 11th round. I'm just making this up, obviously. But then you draft a guy like Will Barton or something. It's obviously Browns are not making sense, but you understand what I'm saying. You draft a guy like Will Barton, and then he gets hurt. You can then drop Will Barton and then add somebody that's playing and maybe even stream that spot to get 6 games out of that spot for a week. If you think of that production total versus not being able to drop a guy like Russell Westbrook, it makes a lot of sense to have the guy that's healthy, because you don't want to drop someone like Westbrook that you would let's say you invested a decent amount of capital on,
Yep.
you invested them, let's say you drafted them in the 4th round or something in a head-to-head, then you can't drop him. You can drop somebody later on.
Yep.
You can't drop him.
Thank you. You actually made the point I was trying to make earlier, but you made it make sense. So I appreciate that, because that was what I was getting at, which was like, yes, obviously Rob Covington turned out to be an incredible fantasy player, but 2 years ago we were still sitting on the, maybe he'll be a top 75 guy, and he was awful. He was a top 200 guy for a couple of weeks, and so in that season where I had these 2 or 3 guys that I was sitting on that were injured, and I thought, these guys are easy top 50, top 60 guys when they come back. I can't drop them. I ended up dropping Covington, and he was freaking awesome starting by like early December. So that killed me, and if I hadn't drafted the injured guys, I would have been able to drop someone else at the end of my bench, someone that and even if I still dropped Covington, at least I would have had guys earlier that I drafted that weren't actually hurt. So that's where I sit on that one. I would love it, by the way, if you guys listening had additional thoughts on this. I'd love to take this thing into Twitter. I think it's a really interesting idea. I just think that there's the value in not falling way behind in your league is dramatically underestimated. Getting off to a good start allows you to be the team that picks up injured guys that other teams have to drop mid-season when they run into a problem. I played that card this year. I forced myself, Brandon, to get off to a really good start in a head-to-head league, and I was able to pick up Jonas Valanciunas, who got dropped when he was hurt. They ended up getting traded, and without that move, I don't win the league. So, if I'm sitting in 6th, 7th place and I'm fighting for a playoff spot, I can't afford to hold Valanciunas for a month, but I was in 2nd place at the time. So I picked him up. Yeah, I dropped a slot or 2, but then he ended up winning me categories that I had no business winning without him on my team. So I think that there's this kind of cumulative ability when you get off to a quick start. It allows you all these extra avenues, and that I think is where we could put in that one. Brandon, I want to mention one other thing that I talked to Ethan about on Monday, and that is the idea of punting anything. Have you and I don't think we've talked about the punt ideas before.
No, we have not.
What is your take on it? Because I sort of revised some of my theories for this offseason.
I hate it. And I know you're someone that I remember you tweeting all the time how you're punting points or you're punting blocks or something like that. Well, I don't think you would ever punt blocks. You love blocks.
I do love blocks.
I just don't like you to ever punt blocks. But I just don't like it because then you put yourself in a really deep hole. By the way, I am absolutely punting saves in one of my baseball head-to-head leagues.
I don't even want to talk about baseball fan. I'm so bad at fantasy baseball, it's insane. I don't understand. I watch a lot of baseball. I think I understand it, but fantasy-wise, I can't keep up. It's like my brain shuts down when the NBA season ends, and I can't handle just rolling right into another sport.
It's frustrating. But the thing is, in baseball, it's easier because closers change so often that you can go and you can add a closer, and next thing you know, you go from 0 to 3. So it's easier to make that up. But if you decide to go ahead and punt a category like assists or something like that, then you put yourself in a tough position because let's say one of your best players, who's your best rebounder, he gets hurt. Then you're kind of in trouble because now you might be losing rebounds and you're losing assists. And maybe that guy who got you rebounds also got you blocks. So I don't love it. I like to have a more balanced approach.
So here's my slight revision because generally I am adamantly opposed to a traditional punt build, meaning I don't think...
Especially in Roto, by the way. Roto, I mean, head-to-head is much easier to punt than Roto.
Yes, and I have an 11-category league where I think it's pretty easy to punt something because there's so many opportunities to win, so many categories you can come up with that giving away one doesn't really do that much damage to you. In Roto, I usually don't set out to punt points. I usually just get to the midway point of the season and then realize that I'm bottom 2 in points. It just always seems to happen because I love defensive stats so much, and I love being decent in turnovers. I don't know why. That's just the way I was built. I think it's easy to win those categories because a lot of people ignore them. And so then at that point, I'm like, you know what? All right, whatever. Worst case scenario, I lose 1 point in the points category. I could use that one guy on my team who's actually good at scoring and turn him into somebody who's really good at rebounding and assisting or, steals and assists. And then I gain a couple of points. The ROI is up net positive. So that's when I make that move. The slight revision to my theory has been in a 9-category head-to-head format, I think I'm okay with punting turnovers now. Because the more that I think about it, the more that head-to-head, especially come playoff time, is all about who can maximize the number of games you're playing. So you're probably going to lose turnovers then anyway.
Correct. Yeah, that makes sense. And even with your roto theory, with that, you are still going a couple months into the season before you realize that you're not getting points. So you're not punting from the outstretch. I hate punting at the draft. That makes no sense whatsoever to me.
Correct.
Because if you're going to go in a roto league and say, all right, I'm going to punt this category, you're setting yourself up for failure right away because you're already giving yourself one category that sucks, and you don't know that maybe 2 or 3 other categories suck too. But in this case, where you're bottom 2 in points and you're 2 or 3 months in, and you know that you're probably not going to catch up, then you can go ahead and trade for something that's going to get you assists, steals, and blocks or something like that.
Yep, and even more so, while we're talking about the draft day thing, you might punt something on draft day. You might decide you're punting assists, and 2 weeks into the season, there might be a point guard that surfaces that ends up averaging 7.5 assists a ball game that nobody drafted. You know, these guys, the first couple weeks of the season, there's a lot of weird stuff that pops up on the waiver wire. You have no idea what sort of categories those guys are going to end up covering. So to give up on something before the first day really does. It limits your player pool. It makes these hot pickups useless to you. Like if you decided you were punting assists and a point guard comes out of nowhere 5 days into the season, you don't even have a reason to pick him up other than to try to immediately trade him for somebody else. To me, that's a silly way to set out. But like I said, I'm willing to give up on a category. I call it giving up as opposed to punting since I'm halfway through. It's like, all right, you know what? This is all about a return on my investment. But yeah, and obviously with Roto, I'm also talking about there has to be a games cap because then if there's no games cap, then you could probably apply the same turnover logic there. You end up doing a bunch of streaming. That's a terrible format, by the way. If everybody's just streaming 2 or 3 guys every day in a Roto league, you got to get a games cap if you don't have one. I think pretty much everybody does. Head-to-head, daily leagues are largely unlimited, like transitional stuff. Obviously, you can't make
normally 5 or 6 transactions per week.
Right? Yeah, you've got a limit on how many ads you can make, but like in terms of moving guys on and off of your bench, you can do that as much as you want every day. Oh, yeah. So you want your bench to be deep, you want them to be healthy, and you don't want to take any zeros. And in the playoffs, you want to stream a little bit. So unless your opponent is just the worst at turnovers and your team was really, really good, if you're going to try to have 6 or 7 more games than the team you're playing against, you are probably going to lose turnovers. So officially, I am going on record today on May the 1st, 2019, and saying that I am no longer opposed to unlimited daily, I don't need to say unlimited, I guess, but daily moves, head-to-head, 9 category. I'm no longer opposed to punting turnovers. You heard it here today. It was hard to say, but I feel okay about it.
Bravo.
Thank you. Yes, a much-needed applause from the peanut gallery. Anything to add on the punt stuff? I wanted to bring that up with you before we throw a bow on this thing.
No, I think you hit it on the head.
All right. He's the wonderful Brandon Marcus. I am Dan Besbris. Enjoy the playoffs over the next few days, Brandon. I'll talk to you in a week.
Hey, you too, buddy.
This was Fantasy NBA Today at Dan Besbris, at BD Marcus. If you want to give us a follow on Twitter. Tomorrow, I got to remember who goes when now. I had it written out and then it flip-flopped. I believe it's Neil and Ethan tomorrow, and then Adrian and Coach will wrap things up on Friday here on Fantasy NBA Today. I'll be back with you and Ethan on Monday. That'll be the next time you have to deal with me. Hopefully I'll still be healthy then. Maybe I'll go 5 straight days without catching an illness. We can dream. We can dream. He's Brandon. I'm Dan. Have a great night. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.